Good morning, Year 12. I hope you're all safe and well and that your families are keeping safe and well too. It was lovely to speak to most of you on the phone last week. Apologies to those of you that I couldn't get through to. I will try again this week so we can have a bit of a catch up about how things are going. Now, what quite a few of you mentioned as a concern is exam skills, which I think is completely expected and pretty normal for this time of year anyway, let alone given the current circumstances. So what I'm going to do this week is a slightly different format to what we have been following the last 2 weeks. On the slides that follow are going to be the instructions and some tips on how to answer this question to the best possible level that you can. I'm going to talk you through each stage, and then at the end I would like you to write your essay, which I will mark and give you feedback on. Okay, so the most important part of any exam question, and this applies to America, India and Britain, which is the paper we've yet to study, is making sure you can plan your questions appropriately. Now what you can see here are the steps that I highly recommend you follow regardless of question, because it will make sure that you fully focus your answer on the question asked. So step 1 should take you 20 seconds, but it is so important because it makes sure that you fully have understood and therefore will address the question. So as you can see here, I have highlighted successfully, consolidate and the dates. Now the dates are really important because if you talk about anything outside of that date range, you won't get credited in the mark scheme. Step number 2 is optional, but at this stage I would highly recommend it. When you get to the exam, if you're feeling confident about the question, you might not need to do step 2. So step 2 is identify what you could talk about. Now again, once you've done some revision, that should only take you 30 seconds in the exam as well, to just bullet point or list in the margin the possible things you could talk about. So you can see from this list here, these are the things you could talk about in this question. It doesn't mean that you will, but these are things that you could mention when we come to decide that in a minute. Step number 3 is really important for what we call setting a criteria, which I'm going to talk to you about on the next slide. So step number 3 is identifying the level 5 word, phrase or concept. Now what I mean by that is in every single question there will be a word or phrase that the essay is hinged on. Okay, so in this case the word consolidate is what shapes this essay and is what your analysis needs to be formed on. So this idea of consolidate will form your level 5 word or concept, and your whole argument is hinged around the idea consolidate. Look at step number 4, which is linked to the 4-step process I started showing you on the previous slide. It's all about setting a criteria. Now before we actually look at how you do that, because it does take quite a lot of practice, I just wanted to show you on the mark scheme why the practice is so important. As you can see, in level 3, level 4 and level 5, bullet point 3 is all about making a judgment, and do take some time to read these properly before you move on to the next slide. In both levels 3, 4 and 5, it all talks about this idea of setting a criteria. At level 3, there's just an attempt to do so. So they want to see you having a go just to get sort of 50% in your essay. Level 4 and level 5, there will be an expectation that you have set criteria and that you are using them in some way to come to a judgment. Now this is probably the hardest skill, and the same applies in America, India and again in Britain when we study it. You will be expecting to set criteria, and like I said, it takes a bit of practice. So on the next slide I'm going to talk you through how you set a criteria, and particularly for this question, what your criteria would look like. Okay, setting the criteria takes a lot of practice, and I know I've said that already, but I just want to reiterate to you how important it is not to give up if you find it tricky first time round. For every single question, when you are setting a criteria, you always ask yourself the same question in your mind. So This question, how successfully did Congress consolidate their position between 1920 to 30? In your head, you need to ask yourself, if Congress successfully consolidated themselves, what would that mean or look like? That is your criteria question. Setting a criteria means you have to specify to the examiner, if this were the case, this is what it would look like. So for example, as you can see round the speech bubble here, I have said, if Congress had successfully consolidated themselves, what would that look like? Well, it might look like they are organised. It might mean that they have unity. It might mean they have respect and support. It might mean they have membership from Indian society. Any question at all, to set your criteria, you ask yourself, if this question was true, what would it look like? And then in your introduction, you would say, if Congress consolidated themselves, it would mean X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to show you an introduction on the next slide. Right, what you can see here is the start of an introduction which really explicitly sets a criteria, as I was talking about on the earlier slide. Now, generally, introductions require three things. Criteria must be in every introduction. Factors will only be relevant if it is a factor-based question. So in this case, factors is actually not necessary. And a judgment. Every single introduction will have criteria and a judgment, and needs to if you want to get a level 4 or a level 5. So if we have a look at this introduction I've got down here, what you can see is where I've very explicitly embedded the criteria. So in the years 1920 to 30, Congress fought to consolidate themselves so they would become a strong political force in India. If Congress had consolidated themselves in the years 1920 to 30, it would mean that they had grown in support/membership, they had unity and organisation, and they had gained respect and support from the British Raj. With this in mind, it is possible to argue that. And what I will then go on and do, and I'll talk to you about that in a second, is using the criteria to make a judgment. But what you should be able to see here, and what the examiner will be able to see here, is a really clear, almost like a success criteria of what Congress would need to have done, or what position they would need to be in for us to accurately say they have consolidated themselves. And what you should now do in your essay is essentially prove at various different points in time whether they had support, whether they were united and organised, and whether they gained respect. And only if they gained all of those things could you therefore say they successfully consolidated themselves. If they gained some of those things but not all of them, then your judgment is going to reflect that. And so actually, once you've got into the habit of setting a criteria, it makes your judgment naturally much easier to formulate and follow. Okay, so what you have here is a suggested, very, very basic essay plan, and this is the kind of plan I would expect to see when it comes to sort of the exam and you have to do it in time conditions. Now, I know all of you have submitted an essay plan, which I'm going to look at today and tomorrow and get back to you as soon as I can. So your plans may not look exactly the same as this, which is completely fine. Now, with this question, I had quite a few of you email me last week in terms of how you might structure it. You can't do it by factors because it is not a factor-based question. It's asking you to focus on one thing: how far did they consolidate between these years? Now, my advice to you, if you get a question that focuses on a long period of time that isn't a factor question, so this is the perfect example, I would always approach beginning, middle, and end. The reason why is I think it helps you very easily to have a very sophisticated judgment. Because one of the things you have to get into your brains and really sort of embed in your thinking is that history is not stagnant. So it will never be as simple to just say yes or no to say they did consolidate or they did not consolidate. Because in that 10 years, things change. So what would have been accurate in 1920 to 1924, and the judgment you would make on those 4 years, is very different to the judgment you might make in 1930. So by doing beginning, middle, end, it prevents you from just making this black and white yes, no judgment, which is really not sophisticated. For level 5, you want to show that you've considered the entire time period, and this will allow you to do so. So as you can see, paragraph 1, I've suggested you're going to talk at the beginning of the time period, so you're going to talk up to about 1924. You're going to talk about the failure of non-cooperation, Congress reorganising themselves and increasing their membership, and Gandhi's back to basics. And using those things as your evidence, the judgment you would make at the beginning is that Congress were on their way to consolidating themselves. They haven't fully consolidated themselves because they haven't met all of your criteria yet, but they've met some of your criteria, so they're on their way to consolidating. In the middle of the time period, which we're going to put as 1928, which I know mathematically isn't in the middle, but roughly speaking, in 1928, we're actually now going to argue the opposite and say Congress haven't consolidated themselves by this point. And this is because the evidence being the Young Hooligans and the Nehru Report, which is proof that they did not have unity, they were not organised, and therefore they possibly couldn't have gained respect from the British. Therefore, if we consider our criteria, they cannot have consolidated themselves. Nevertheless, by the time you get to 1929 and 1930, you could say that Congress were on their way to consolidating themselves again. In fact, you might say they consolidated themselves to some extent by this point, and this is because the Lahore Congress and the Salt March proved that they had support and membership. It proves they had organisation and unity. The only thing they didn't necessarily have at this point was respect and support from the British, which you can prove through the way they suppressed the Salt March. But what you can say by 1930 is most of your criteria have been met, so they have definitely consolidated themselves to a point. Now, what you should be able to see there is by doing beginning, middle, end, your judgment is able to change and evolve over time, which allows you to make a really sophisticated answer to this question, which you can see is now the completed introduction below. In red is the judgment that reflects what I've just discussed. Right, so your homework for this week is to give this essay a go, and I would like everybody to hand me a fully completed essay by close of play on Thursday, so about 6 p.m. Please, please, please do not leave this to an hour before Thursday's deadline, because I do not want to see half-finished essays submitted to me or people emailing say, I haven't done this bit because I didn't know what to write. If you are stuck, if you're not sure what to do, please give me an email or post on MS Teams, and I will either try and phone you to explain your question in person, or I will email back to you if that is easier. Please make sure you have got your introduction, 3 paragraphs and a conclusion. I'm not worried about timed conditions at this point, so take as long as you need. However, be realistic in terms of how much you could actually write in an essay, in the exam. So you probably are not looking at more than a page and a half, 2 pages of typed work. Please, if possible, do this online, because then it will be much, much easier for me to give you feedback on a typed document than if you write it and send me photos. If you have any questions, you know what my email address is, so please get in touch. On Friday, I'll be setting you a quiz as per normal, but because we won't have learned any new content this week, I'm going to set you a revision quiz on topic 1, which is mainly India in World War I and the Amritsar massacre, so you may want to do some revision on this as well. Have a lovely week, and I will speak to you all soon.